a true honor and delight to be here with Professor Samuel Heilman, who is a professor of sociology and Jewish studies at Queens College, and a scholar, although he prefers to say student, of Chassidut, one of the leading luminaries of helping us understand this world. So thanks for taking a little time.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So to start with this question of what's it like to be a Chassid in America today, 21st century? What's it like?
Well, first of all, to be a Chassid in America today doesn't mean that you are part of only a pietistic movement. It doesn't mean that you're somebody who sings and dances all the time, which is what we associate early Hasidism with. Today it means that you're part of a very stringent and sometimes insular Orthodox community, that you live with other Hasidim, and that, of course, the most important person in your life, other than your family, maybe even more than your family, is your Rebbe, or the tzaddik that you believe acts as an intermediary between you and God. And if you don't have such a Rebbe, then you're at a disadvantage, although we know that there's at least one group for whom not having a Rebbe hasn't been a disadvantage as well.
So when would you date back this period of Chassidut that we experience today in America? When does this period begin?
Well, for the most part, Hasidism, as you I'm sure know, is a movement that begins in the 18th century in Eastern Europe, what we today call Eastern Europe. Many people thought that it reached its golden age in the 19th century, but in many ways it's reached its platinum age here in the 20th and the 21st. For a long time, Hasidim believed that there was no reason to go anywhere other than Eastern Europe. And in fact, part of it was because their leaders, like many of the rabbis, the Orthodox rabbis of Europe, said, don't go to the land of promise, because Jews might survive there, but Judaism would not. And don't go to the promised land, because that's a heresy, and how could we follow these Zionists and heretics and socialists? There also Jews might survive, but Judaism will not. We know in the light of history that they were dead wrong. That advice was dead wrong, because Hasidism and Hasidim really suffered. They were decimated because they were easy to pick out. And the truth is that in both the land of promise and the promised land, Hasidism has been doing better than it ever did before in its life. They were wrong. It is a place where Hasidism has flourished. There are no pogroms. There's good health care. There's a good welfare system. Yes. So they have really flourished. And so this platinum age, I would say it begins, in the years after the Holocaust, when Orthodoxy in general started coming to America. And at first, many of the Hasidim were unsure, could they survive here? Could they really rebuild here? But we know that they have managed to rebuild, and in many ways they rebuilt beyond anything they could have imagined. But with that have come certain problems, and the problems are that they believe they can be in America but not of America, and at the same time they're very heavily dependent upon what America gives them, everything from the welfare payments, the subsidized housing. When we look at some of the characteristics of the communities that Hasidim are in, we're bowled over at how they manage to survive just economically and materially in this world. So,
how do they keep this this narrative alive with such social acceptance in America? This historical narrative of pogroms and Shoah and fear of the outsider. Right. If they go to work, they experience a very different America.
Right. So they have two ways of looking at America. On the one hand, they think of it as a term that you often hear as a malchut shel chesed, that this is a kingdom of kindness, which allows for multiculturalism and allows for difference. And certainly we've grown accustomed, certainly in New York and in the East Coast and places like LA, we've gotten used to the idea of seeing people who look Chasidic. On the other hand, they also have a feeling that too much contact with that culture, the larger culture, is dangerous, and that Even the smallest kind of contact is a slippery slope, and so they create a world in which it's very difficult to make that contact. It's amazing. In an open society, you wonder how do you keep people who are living subway ride away from Sin City? How do you keep them inside? So, in fact, there are two devices that they use that they've been very successful with. One is that they don't provide their young people with the skills to survive in that outside world.
Right.
The education that they give them really is an education that makes them literate in the Jewish and Hasidic world, but not in the world at large.
Not even fluent in English at times.
No, in many cases, English is a second language for them. And the second thing they do is they demonize that outside world. They say, you don't want to be like those people.
Right, right.
But something has changed radically in their world that makes that much more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that you can carry the outside world in your pocket. And when it comes in your pocket, you can look in that outside world, and we know that the internet has radically changed their lives. Even the rabbis that were opposed to the internet when they had their great meeting at Citi Field in New York, they streamed the meeting online. And when I went to one of the Chasidic rabbis, who was one of the leaders of this, and I was waiting in his antechamber to talk to him, and I pulled out my smartphone, and there was Wi-Fi in his antechamber.
Very interesting. So you talk about the flourishing today. What's some of the quantitative data that we see?
Well, so it's very difficult to know the quantitative data because there aren't that many surveys that Hasidim are willing to participate in part of their demonization of that outside world. But it turns out that there are 3 communities that are part of the U.S. Census because they are municipalities in America and in the state of New York. One of those is Keser Village in New York, which is largely Vision and Sir Hasidim. One is Kiryas Joel or Kiryas Yoel, which is a Satmar village in Orange County. And a third is New Square, which is Skvira Hasidim. And there we know things. And when we look at these numbers, they're extraordinary. I'll just give you some examples. So, for example, the median household in Kesar is 18, and this is as of 2016, $18,500 a year. The persons in poverty in that village, almost 78% of the people are at the poverty level. The educational attainment of high school graduate or higher, 67%. People without health insurance, 1%. So the welfare system is certainly taking care of them. And at the same time, their housing value, their median housing value, is almost $600,000. How is all of that? How is that possible? When we look at Kiryas Joel, which is one of the most well-known 100% Satmar, the largest Hasidic group in America, median household income, $26,000. Persons in poverty, 56%. Male median income, $25,000. I could go through all of these numbers. They're extraordinarily low. It's the poor. These are the poorest people in the state
So
of New
the
York.
poverty is very real. Whenever I hear these numbers, someone raises the question of
Is there black money?
Is all the income reported, right? I mean, how pervasive
So
would that
there's
be?
no question that if you put your money in what's called the Gemach, Milat Chesed, which is a community charity organization, it doesn't show up to be your money. And there are lots of ways to hide that. On the other hand, they have these large families, and poverty is a real issue. Yet, one of the other things that is true for this community is that the well-to-do help out the poor. And in fact, one of the things we find is that in general, in impoverished communities, there's a lot of help goes on among families, between families.
And there are so many critiques that are thrown at this community, and some of them rightfully so. But I do think this area where we really can learn from is the value of internal chesed, of this kindness that they show one another internally.
No question about it.
They might not, universalistically, they might not hold any of their commitments, but the way they treat their
But at the same time, they tend to have a charitable feeling for their own more
Right.
so than the general
That's
Jewish
right,
community.
right.
So part of the problem is that many people in the Federation world, for example,
Yeah.
say that they're very good on the taking end, but they're not. They
Right.
don't feel that
Right.
same commitment to Klal Yisrael.
Yeah.
that
So let me
people
ask you.
look for.
So on the one hand, do you believe we should be advocating for externally for higher secular education standards to
I
be
wouldn't call it secular education standards, but I think we do them a
literacy?
disservice.
Yes. Right.
And there is an organization of ex-Charedim and some people
Right.
who are
Yeah,
still
Fed,
in that
yeah,
field.
yeah.
Yafed.
Yeah.
Right. So, which is people who are arguing that we need a better
Right.
education
Right.
for our children.
And yet their rabbis are right. If they enter the workforce, more will leave.
Well, so that's the fear, but I
Yeah.
think the argument is
Uh-huh.
that there should be enough strength in their belief
Yeah.
and in their view
Right.
of the world
That's right.
that would enable them. We know that orthodoxy can
Yeah.
stand up to the challenge of
Yeah.
modernity. That if you're orthodox, you don't. It doesn't mean that you can't be in the world and you
Mhm.
can't be connected to the world.
Mhm.
And I think there's much evidence that in a previous age, before the slide to the right of orthodoxy,
Good, we'll come back to that. Yeah.
even Hasidism
Yeah.
could find a place where their children could be engaged in the outside world. I'll give you one example.
Yeah.
I write in my book on Who Will Lead Us on Hasidic succession about the Bian dynasty. Now, the original Biana Rebbe, who came to the Lower East Side, his children went to university.
Mm.
His children studied. Yes, maybe they didn't stay as Hasidic, perhaps, as their father, but they're definitely engaged Jewishly, observant Jewishly. The assumption that today's Hasidism makes that it's either you're observant
Right.
100% and you cannot be engaged with the world outside, or you're not. I think that either or mentality
Right.
that we find that is so prevalent in the world around us
Yeah.
is not right.
So picking up on this recent book about leadership, you talked about the centrality of the Rebbe in the communities.
Yes.
What do we make of the fact that my understanding is that the only two outreach groups, Breslov and Chabad,
Right.
are the
Don't
two without
have
Rebbe's,
Rebbe's,
right? So and is that precisely what enables them to flourish?
Well, I'm not sure, because I think certainly with Chabad we know that their Rebbes encouraged, certainly the last Rebbe, the seventh Rebbe, encouraged that kind of outreach. But their outreach is a very complicated thing, because Chabad is a movement that is not as much interested in getting people to become observant as they are in getting people to do mitzvot. By that I mean, for Chabad, they are collecting people who are doing mitzvot. Every mitzvah they think sort of is on the scales, and when enough Jews do enough mitzvot, they believe that will tip the balance and bring about the Messianic age. Because when you go to a Chabad house, you'll find that most of the people in there are neither Chabad
Right.
nor Orthodox, nor likely to become that. But what they do is, while they are in the Chabad orbit, they're doing mitzvot, and that's what's important to them. Which is different. It's a different model from other outreach organizations that seek to bring people in and to change their behavior out of a sort of ideological transformation.
So maybe we'll close on the issue of politics. What is the average? How does the average Chassid understand his or her role within the political process in America?
So,
what kind of views
the
are they holding
Chassidim, for the Chassidim, the Rebbe is the mediator, the intermediary between not only them and God, but them and the world. And what is so important about these Rebbes is that they decide how the people will vote. And if they said to vote for a watermelon, the people would vote for a watermelon.
That's it, really.
Yeah, so, I mean, as far as they're concerned, they will do their notion of collective responsibility is much more important than individual choice. For them, the individual is subordinate to the collective.
So in that case, what's guiding the Rebbe's views then? Is it just money? Is it just money?
I don't know if it's money, but the Rebbe tries to, the Rebbe or the person who the Rebbe has appointed to be his representative to the political leaders, they decide what is best for our community. And what is best for our community is taking care of all of this poverty that we have, having our schools supported, having welfare for our people, knowing that we can maintain our way of life with a minimum of input from the outside world.
So the Hasidim are not looking at questions of abortion and death penalty and
no,
broader.
Although it would be fair to say that they're more and more conscious of their view of the world being closer to the religiously right-wing communities.
Right.
So in some ways, they share some of the perspectives of the right-wing community, which is they're against sex, drugs, and rock and roll, even though sex... certainly with such a large family, we can't say they're against sex.
So, but you'd say that they're not particularly partisan. Like if you wanted to break down Hasidim in America, how they vote.
Well, no, they are partisan in the sense that they're more and more they vote with the right.
Okay.
And they're, in that sense, Hasidim are not that different from other Orthodox Jews.
Right.
One of the things that we found is that even though the Jews, for example, in the recent elections, 80% of the Jews, 79% of Jews voted for liberal candidates. But the numbers were flipped when it came to Orthodox Jews.
Yeah. So why is that? What's the number one factor for that?
I think the number one factor for that is the Orthodox, first of all, see themselves as having interests that coincide more with those that are expressed by conservative candidates. Things like vouchers for schools, support for Israel, although that's not such a big thing for the Hasidim. And there's also a sense that, and this is not particular to Hasidim, but the Orthodox world feels that the non-Orthodox world doesn't really identify with their concerns in the same way. In some ways, they feel closer to the religious evangelicals than they do to the liberal reform or unaffiliated Jews.
Right. You know, there was a Rebbe out here recently vacationing, and I asked him at the election time who I should vote for, Trump or Hillary, and he didn't want to answer, but I pushed a little, and he said, "It's very, very important to not vote for a woman." That was his answer. I was a little startled by that.
Well, in the publications, they're still very, very concerned about gender separation.
Right.
Again, I think in many ways, this is not Hasidism. This is Orthodoxy and Charediyut, but it's not Hasidism.
Right.
But what has happened to Hasidism is it moved from being a very revolutionary movement in its beginnings that said that the most important thing was how you pray and your devotion to God and your attachment to the tzaddik, to being a movement that said the most important thing is not to be liberal and not to be non-Orthodox, and by your willingness to be completely in line. And if that world, the outside world, likes Technicolor, we like black and white.
Wonderful. Well, I encourage everyone to check out these many wonderful books that have really informed our Jewish self-understanding and beyond over the last number of years, written by Professor Samuel Heilman. So thank you so much
My pleasure.
for this time to talk.